All right, so we've been learning how to draw within Adobe Animate. The next tool I mentioned before that Adobe Animate is a specifically vector-based drawing tool. The next tool I'm going to talk about is called the pen tool. And it's a tool that's used a lot in vector-based programs like Adobe Illustrator or Figma. If you don't know how to use this tool, it's okay. I don't really want to go through it because, to be honest, it's a tool that takes a long time to learn, and Adobe Animate may be not the best program to learn it in. So I'm not going to teach it, but this is kind of one of these like, if you know how to use the pencil, this is just another way of using it. If you don't know how to use it, you can fast forward through this part of the video for a couple minutes, I suppose. But so I'm going to use the pen tool here. Now, if you remember the pen tool creates anchor points. And between those anchor points are segments that create a shape. Okay, so I'm going to grab the pen tool and make sure you're using the pen tool and not the add, delete, or convert anchor point tool. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to, click once. Accidentally added there you go. That right there, that little square, it's kind of hard to see. I can't zoom in because it won't zoom in on that. That is my anchor, okay? And you can see that when I move my cursor, the line follows that anchor. Wherever I click, that's going to place my second anchor sequentially. And then the way it works is that there's a segment between your, there's anchors between your segments between your anchors. So that's anchor one. I'm going to click here. That's anchor two. This is creating a segment, which is really the stroke. That's actually why my line is so thick, is because my stroke is very thick. So I might actually lower that stroke so it's not so crazy. There you go. I'm going to click again. Okay. Now, if you remember how vector pen tool works, if I keep clicking, it's just going to make linear lines. But part of vectors is having the ability to make nice curved lines. I'm going to click and hold with my mouse and drag out. And I have these things here called Bezier handles. The Bezier handles control this curve. So you can see the curve is going out. We call that a convex curve. I can also point it inward and have a concave curve. The closer these handles are to each other, the smaller the curve, the intensity of the arc is. The wider they are, the more intense the arc is. Okay. So when I pull these out, you can see it's creating that arc. Now, what's actually happening is there's two Bezier handles. There's one Bezier handle here, and there's one Bezier handle there. Okay. This controls the curve going into that anchor. This one controls the curve going out of this anchor. Okay, so if I actually put my cursor here like this, you'll notice that it doesn't go straight up like you might suspect it would. It kind of curves outward, right? And it creates that little weird curve. Why is that? Well, that's because of this Bezier handle. Okay. If I was to go here, same thing. It's still following that line, that Bezier handle, at least at the beginning. Okay. I like to say that the Bezier handle is kind of like a cannon. A cannon controls the direction that the cannonball goes in. It's not the cannonball, but it directs the cannonball. And that's kind of what's happening here, where, it's like whatever direction this is, that's going to affect how my curve occurs. So if I go back here, it's still forcing the line to go forward at least a little bit. So what I'm actually going to do is when you're drawing out your Bezier handles, if you hold down the Option or the Alt, you can actually break or reposition this Bezier handle. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that the next line is going to go up. If I point my Bezier handle up and then the next line goes up, I don't get that weird curve, or it goes back to being a straight linear line again. So you can decide how you want your lines to go. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, I want the next curve to go from here to here in a straight line. What I'm going to do is hold down Option or Alt to break this and then point it in the direction that I want my line to go. Like I said, this is not the line, but it's the direction of the line. Okay, which is meaning to say like it's pointing the direction that the line will go. And then when I click here, you get a nice straight line. I come back, probably can't see this, but when you come back with the pen tool, you get a little circle in the lower right-hand corner. That means that you're completing the shape. Okay. Once you've created your shape, this is essentially your stroke, and you can come in here and apply different stroke options like color and things like that. Another thing you could do is you can adjust the anchor points that we just created. The way you would do that is instead of using the selection tool, use the sub-selection tool, okay? This is referred to as a direct selection tool in Illustrator. So the selection tool highlights the entire path, so to speak. The sub-selection tool, sub meaning below, sub-selection tool highlights the subcomponents or the sub parts that make up the path, which would be basically the anchors and the Bezier handles. Okay. Once again, if this is all Greek to you, don't worry about it. You don't need to use this tool. It's just, this is more for people who have an experience working with vector-based programs. So I'm going to use the sub-selection tool, click here, and I've actually highlighted this anchor, and I can move the anchor around. Okay. If you highlight on something that has Bezier handles, you can actually go back and readjust the Bezier handles. So the sub-selection tool is really good if you want to go and make edits to your vector paths. Okay. Some other options we have here include the add anchor point, which would add anchors to your shape. So if I use the add anchor point and I click on the segment here, it's going to add an anchor. Oops, I think I did. Maybe. Yeah, okay. Why would you want to create an anchor? Well, once you create an anchor, there's my anchor that I just created here. Zoom in a little bit on it. I can highlight it, and then I can move it. Okay. I'm going to add an anchor here. I'm going to select that anchor, and then I'm going to move it. Okay. In addition to the add anchor, you can choose the delete anchor. The delete anchor is the reverse. It deletes something, it doesn't add something. So if I click, it removes that anchor. If I click, it removes that anchor. So that removes an anchor, and that removes any segments or curves associated with that anchor. Finally, we have what's called a convert anchor point tool. What that will do is that will convert linear lines, or basically, straight lines, to curved lines, or converts curved lines to linear. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, so this kind of looks like a little arrow. Right now, so for instance, here, this is like a straight line. There's no curve. And even if I was to use the sub-selection tool, there's no Bezier handles associated with it because there's no curve. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this tool. And I'm just going to click in it. I'm going to click and drag on that anchor. And what it's actually going to do is pull out Bezier handles. Okay. Remember, Bezier handles give us curves. So now that I have that, I can go in and adjust these Bezier handles. You'll notice if you have two Bezier handles, typically they work in pairs. So they're sort of opposite of one another. You can kind of see if I move one, I sort of move the other one. If you don't want to do that, you just want to move one, We can break the handle like when we were breaking the handle when we were drawing. So what I'm going to do is hold down the Option or the Alt key, and then that allows me to work with just one handle as opposed to working with both. Okay. Now that's taking two linear lines and adding curves to them. You can also do the opposite. So right now, this is a curve. This is a curve. If I take this, instead of clicking and dragging, I just click once. See how it removes that curve? So it will convert curve lines to linear lines. So if I come in here and I do that, you can see how it removed that curve, and then it just brought them back to straight linear lines. All right, so that's using the pencil. Like I said, if you've never used the pencil, you don't have to use it. This is just another sort of tool for people who know how to use it. But if that's kind of weird and doesn't make sense to you, that's perfectly fine. Don't worry about it. Let's talk about the eraser tool. The eraser tool is about 6 down from the top. The eraser tool, you can create your eraser to be bigger or smaller. I'm just going to you can choose what kind of shape you want. So you can make it bigger or smaller. Now, by default, it works the way you kind of assume an eraser would work. By the way, if you wondered what I just did there, you can do an edit undo or Command or Control Z to undo what you just did. If you really don't like what you've done and you haven't made a save, you can also do what's called a revert. A revert means it'll go back to the last saved point. So if I do File, Revert, it's going to go back to the last save point, which is when I started the document. There you go. Okay. We can be a little bit more specific with how we apply our eraser. So down here at the bottom, there's this thing that kind of looks like a little circle with a line through it, kind of like a Pokemon ball. And it's called eraser mode. And it starts with erase normal. And what that means is that it just kind of works the way you'd expect an eraser to work. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag it to where it says erase fills. Okay. What that means is that if I click and drag, or if I use the eraser, it erases it, but it only erases the fills. It does not erase the stroke, or they call it the line, but the stroke of the item is not affected at all. Okay. I can switch the mode to erase lines, which is basically the opposite. Instead of erasing the fill, it'll erase the stroke or the line. So if I do this, it's going to erase the stroke, but not the fill of the object. Okay. You can erase selected fills, which means that what you would do is I'm going to select the fill of this item on the right, but I'm not going to select the one on the left. I'm going to grab the eraser, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. So I've erased both, but when I let go, it only affects the one on the right. Now, why does it only affect the one on the right? So selected fills means it only will erase if you've selected it first. So I selected this, I didn't select this. That's why this one got affected and not that one. If I was to go back, undo it, and reverse it, where I select this but not this, and do the same thing, you can see it affects this one and not this one because this one was selected and this one was not. So the selected fills just lets you be more specific about what you're affecting in case you don't want to accidentally affect things. There's also erase inside. This is kind of the same as erase selected. Instead of having to select something first, essentially what you're going to do is whichever object you click on first, that is the one you're going to affect. So if I click here and I do this, and then I go over here, it's going to affect this one and not this one because that, the one on the right is the one I selected first. If I undo this, Command Z, this time I'm going to select the one on the left first and then go over to the one on the right. And you can see it affects the one on the left and not the one on the right. Okay. So basically it affects whichever object you affected first, essentially. Okay. All right. Let's talk about the paint bucket. So I have this shape here that was drawn with a brush. Okay. And I'm going to grab this paint bucket tool. And we talked about using the paint bucket to fill in something that has an outline, but not an interior. In other words, it has a stroke, but not a fill, right? And if I try to come in here and I try to use it, it's not going to work, okay? It's not filling. Why is it not filling? Well, in order to fill a shape in Adobe Animate, there cannot be any holes or any gaps. See how there's like a little gap there at the very top of my item? That's the reason why I can't close this. Now, what you could do is I could come back and I could try to, close this, oops, by, drawing a line here, right? Now that I've done that, I might be able to fill it. Yeah, I still have a hole somewhere. Oh, oops. Oh, there we go. Let me close that. All right, now it worked. That's kind of annoying though. So there's actually a way to fix this problem. So what I'm going to do is, let's say you were drawing your object, but there's still a gap, something like this. What you can do is when you use the fill bucket, there's an option down here. It's called gap size. You can also get it from the properties thing here. When you click on it, it says don't close gaps. That's usually the default. It says close small gaps, close medium gaps, close large gaps. Basically, you either kind of want to close gaps or you don't. Let's use close large gaps. That means that even if your object has a gap, it'll still close it for you. See how it still works even though I have a gap there? So that is the fill gap option. Okay. So for instance, I'm going to grab a brush tool. I'm just going to draw something. Let's say I draw this shape. I'm just going to leave a little hole there. If I tried to fill this with the paint bucket tool, it's not actually okay. It worked because I turned on the close large gaps. Normally that would not work because of that gap right here at the top. But if I turn on the close large gaps, there we go. Now I should be able to fill in that area there. Okay. So just be, careful when, you're drawing something and you want to fill it in. Make sure that there's no holes. It's kind of like old MS Paint. I don't know if you've ever used old MS Paint where it's like, if there's any hole, the color will spill out. Adobe Animate's like that. The only difference is instead of spilling out, it just doesn't fill it at all. Okay. So why don't you guys try that out? That was 12, 13, and 14, please.